Hey there, welcome to week 6. Our course is called Realism and Naturalism. So, having reached the midway point of the semester, it makes logical sense that we make the turn this week from the first subject into the second. Our module overview begins with a quote by Donald Pizer, and you should probably know by now that I'm not going to complain about that in principle. However, the quote there, differentiating naturalism from realism, loses a good deal of its punch if you're not aware of the critical history of how naturalism has been regarded. I might sum it up with a single metaphor, one that applies to most of the criticism of the 20th century. If 19th century literature had two children, realism and naturalism, realism was treated as the stable, successful one who got a job, settled down, had a family, and contributed to the community. Naturalism, on the other hand, was the one who always leached off his brother, quit one job after another, never had a successful relationship with anyone, and who always blamed the world for his problems. This isn't really an exaggeration. In the 1920s, the premier literary historian of the first half of that century, V.L. Parrington, published a 4-volume work called Main Currents in American Thought. It's a truly seminal work for compiling the history of American literature up to that point. In it, he boiled down his view of naturalism by defining it succinctly as pessimistic realism. And that view really stuck. The idea that realism and naturalism were essentially the same, but that the latter was purely bad-tempered. So this is where I actually do complain about the quote, because it's been cherry-picked to give very much the same impression about naturalism that Parrington does, emphasizing its focus on the negative. Let me mention, Donald Pizer is 89 years old and still writes occasionally, and that means he spent the last 58 years making his case that naturalism is so much more than being negative. So I'm happy to see his name on the overview, but less happy with how it's used. Practically, the result of connecting realism and naturalism, as has been the historical precedent, indicating that one is a bad version of the other, was a kind of critical dismissal of naturalism as a sort of aberrant subgenre, a literary novelty, but not something which could be said to be part of the broad stream of development in American literature. And of course, the problem with a dismissal like that is how tightly, in reality, naturalism connects to tenets and practices we see developing in modernism. If we ignore naturalism, then modernism seems like it appears spontaneously from brilliant and innovative minds like Gertrude Stein and Sherwood Anderson and even Hemingway. When we take notice of naturalism, we can suddenly see connections between these writers' projects and practices in literature which immediately preceded them. So, back to Pizer and making distinctions between realism and naturalism. What we can see his work as doing as a critical movement to offer a fuller understanding for naturalism rather than simply saying it is a kind of realism. Now, we've been looking at realism and we've seen that it has many aspects, that the way it plays out in Twain, for instance, is very different from the way we see it working with Henry James, and that this is very different than the regional expressions, and again, it's totally different than variations we see in journalistic practice. So we can, I think, see the need not to rely on a reductive definition of realism when we start thinking about defining naturalism, because realism is already pretty complex. So where are we going to start? What area of realism are we going to say is naturalism corresponding to? So those are my thoughts for getting us going for this week. We have a pretty standard week going for the work that's required. We have another close reading based on text by Crane, and another discussion for us to do. So read, think, start building comparisons between what we've done so far with realism and what you see happening in this new turn towards naturalism. If you have any questions, if you need any help, feel free, let me know, and I'll see you next week.